Hands in the shot.
Yep.
And then I'm going to zoom over here.
Got it.
I might get around
Mm-mm.
here. You're fine.
It's my bad.
Okay.
Oh, you be back there?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I'll just be roaming.
Oh, okay.
All right. Whenever you're ready, Michael.
I've got a clear path now for you to roam. When you think about like the intersection of race and music, you know, what comes to mind? What do you think the issues are? Well, certainly not the issues per se, but you know, certainly in the 30s, 40s, 50s, we had this collision of blues and country, and eventually the emergence of rock and roll, and that moment where race, especially like through Elvis, initially came together in some ways. Not always harmoniously either, but because there's many people that resented Elvis. You know, he certainly was that initial, in a lot of ways, intersection of race and music. But yeah, when you think about that, what comes to mind?
Wow.
Yeah.
Race and music in America. Whoa. um, Man, this is so much stuff. We can talk about forms, and obviously, like um, people talk about the intersection of European music and African music created forms such as blues and jazz and country and whatever, and which mutated into rock and roll, which became, you know, the language of the world in many ways. Um, what's strange about the whole thing is that um, these things mixed, they come together, they still work together to create all these beautiful things, languages that people can express all kinds of things in, emotions, ideas, whatever. But there's this kind of schizophrenic identity thing about it that these cultures can mix and create something, but a lot of the people who helped create it are still ostracized, marginalized, and even today being erased from the face of history. You know, it's madness, man. Absolute madness. Um, and the kind of things that I try, I try to observe life, understand where people are coming from, understand a lot of craziness that people uh, do in this world has to do with their pain, their misunderstanding, their about life, their unwarranted fears about lack, um, that kind of stuff. But occasionally it does get to me, and it does piss me off, pull me out of myself. I try not to be there in life. You know, I try not to be in this spot where I let these things pull me off my square. And because I've tried, I've had good teachers, my father, my parents, different people in this community um, that have more guided me towards the idea, like my brother Foundation One said, stay on your own square. And you know, people would come to him about things that they were doing, and so his first question is he'd ask them is, "What are you building?" So what I try to do is stay in this frame of mind where, like, if I see something like that, rather than getting angry, getting pissed off, going crazy, and yelling about it, if I see somebody being mistreated, it probably means more to them that I could call them up, go by and say, man, you're doing okay, than it does for me to get pissed off and scream about it. But sometimes, I guess that's the hardest in me. I will say something about it.
Yeah, in the song "I Come to Think About It," you definitely explore this whole issue of not letting it pull you off your square, pull you out of your center, and like you say in the song, make you forget whose child you are. Talk about that song a little bit, just a bit.
Accounting is one of those things where I like, it's one of them days I was tripping. I was pissed, man, about all this stuff going on in the world, um, politics, demagoguery, all this kind of madness. And it got me to the point where I had to think, whoa, wait a minute, man, don't let these people make you do something crazy and start talking crazy. So Accounting came from that. Accounting has a number of layers, and you see from the dedication at the beginning, a couple of my friends who happen to play Accounting. Accounting is like an African instrument that's pretty much a forerunner to banjo. And so banjo really has African origins when you hear the banjo in there. So I wanted to address that and use the concept of the accounting and the banjo to overcome, first of all, to address some racial stereotypes like, black folks don't play country music, banjo. I'm like, come on, man. Even Bill Monroe at one point talked about bluegrass. He learned a lot of this stuff because there were, like, in those days, all these black musicians in the South, even in slavery times, people play, black musicians played the music. So, and it's, you listen to it carefully and you can hear some of the Irish folk music, but you hear the African folk music in it. And the instruments like the banjo. So I wanted to address that. And then the idea of accounting, just kind of like playing with some dialects. I can't think about it, like I'm going to think about this. But the big thing is that I was addressing some of the ideas of the hypocrisy where people have criticized, in this case, let's be honest, like criticizing the black community. Oh, what is this, like violence and all this stuff? And I'm like looking at all these school shootings at the time, people shooting up country concerts, folks dropping bombs on populations, killing off people in this. And my thing was like, you got the nerve to talk to me about being violent? Get real, man. We're a violent species, and I'm going to own that. I'm going to own that on myself. But I'm not going to own that by myself. And that's what that piece was about. But I had gotten kind of pissed off, and like I said, I was trying to remember, I addressed the idea of whose child I am. And that works on two levels, because as a child of the Creator, I have to recognize that all these are my brothers and sisters. They may be off track, and I may not agree with what they're doing, but we are from the same mold. We are from the same species. We are created of the same substance. So I had to remember whose child I am. So if I talk about this divine father, mother figure, whatever we want to say, different people do it different. But if we talk about this divine, then I have to recognize that I'm part of this humanity. And I got to remember that. And I have to respond in the way that a parent would. I might be upset with my daughter about something that she does, but I'm not going to stop loving my daughter, and I'm not going to try to hurt her and kill her over something. You know what I mean? So these people out there doing all this madness, yeah, I have an obligation to protect myself and my family, and I would do that. But I'm not going to go out there and try to hurt these people because they are insane. There's something wrong with them. They're spiritually ill. The other thing is that on a very basic level, my mother raised me a certain way. So I was also taught, respect your elders. I probably have not been perfect at that, okay? But I try to do that. So when I said, I'll be honest, I don't want to get mad and call people 17 kind of motherfuckers, because my mother would not cotton me saying something like that about anybody. So I was saying, okay, understand that there's some righteous, for lack of a better word, indignation about these things. And my parents told me to resist discrimination, resist these things where people are trying to lord over other people, but they told me not to lose myself in that resistance. I still have to carry myself as a humanity. I cannot, a human being, I can't lose my humanity uh, in resisting inhumane acts and inhumane actions. So that's what I can think about it is. So I can think about this before I trip out.
And that song obviously has spoken word in it too, so let's talk about the spoken word and music together. And we can talk and bring and just naturally bring up K2 and Curtis and whoever else you want to. I mean, for time's sake, if you want to mostly focus on K2, that might not be a bad idea. But you can obviously mention a couple of these other things. But let's talk about let's talk about the spoken word inside of music and how you kind of carry that on. And
Early on, when I started to write music, and I was fortunate to have some guys, I didn't realize how fortunate, how blessed I was to have these experienced musicians, people like Dave Streeter, Dave Sapp, Steve Smeltzer, guys like that, Ken Clee. When I first started playing kind of jazz, I'd write these like really strange tunes. The guys, yeah, okay, man, we'll play that, And they would do that, and so they mentored me. And Dave, in particular, one time told me, he said, "Listen, if you really want to be better at music," he says, "don't spend your time on musicians." He said, "Talk to dancers, poets, painters, sculptors, and to get a different perspective of people who don't have a vested interest in maintaining a certain thing." He said, "Broaden your horizons." And for me, poetry came kind of natural. I was around poets, like particularly K2 Oladawa, and met people like George Calamares, Curtis Christian, both of whom ended up being Indiana Poet Laureates. And being around them emphasized this concept of rhythm and flow in music. And K2, I worked for K2 at Frost Illustrated. I was one of his writers when he was the managing editor, and when he left, I became managing editor. But one of the things that K2 used to say to me when I would write for him, write news articles, and he'd read fiction and stuff that I wrote, is like, "I want to hear the rhythm of you in this. This has to be in you. Speak it with your rhythm." And like K2 emphasized to me with poetry, he and both George, because they told me that it's okay to read poetry, but you need to hear poetry. They both told me that the words that they use aren't as important as the vibration that the words create. And that affected me very heavily in my writing and music, where that's why I realized, like I instinctively kind of knew it was okay for me not to worry about writing proper harmony and proper melody, but to write things that reflected my rhythms, my perspective, because each one of us is given a unique voice. And if we value that as a gift, then we should all speak in our own voices. And I'm going to learn more from you if you speak in your voice than if you try to speak in somebody else's voice I've already heard. And my thing is like, I already read that book. Tell me what yours says. I'm interested in what the person in front of me has to say, not what they read that someone else said. And, I try to tell stories that I know as opposed to stories that were someone else's, that they know far better than me. I can't be George Benson. I can't be Jimi Hendrix. I'm not going to be Shostakovich. And those folks are all like geniuses, and I'm not like putting myself down, but I'm saying I can't be them. They already did that. But I can speak in my own humble way, and because that was a divine gift, if you will, it has value. So I try to do that, and that's what poets encouraged me to do, was to find my own rhythm, find my own voice, and speak in that, and not worry about the meaning of the words based on what other people had already defined, but to take the words and to create vibrations that were unique to me.
Right on, man. So what? One song, "Walking with My Ghost." What's that about?
Ooh, walking with my ghost. I've always been fascinated with blues, but maybe a little different from a lot of people. I mean, I love the hard rocking stuff. You know, Buddy Guy is monster. You know, Buddy Guy is the man. But I also really, really gravitated a lot towards the acoustic blues because somehow it seemed to come from the dust, if you will. People talk about the Delta. People talk about the hill country. They talk about Appalachian blues. They talk about these things, and it's Piedmont, and it all refers back to the dirt somehow. And there's something about the lands, you know, in African cosmology. Um, it's like a bush of people, a bush of ghosts, bush of certain animals, and there are these habitats that they're in. The spirits inhabit the world right next to us. That may not be that alien even in other quote religious ideas or whatever. You have spiritual ideas that the unseen and the seen occupy the same space and they live next to each other. So a lot of that early blues kind of reflected that. It talked about this world, but also talked about the unseen world. So a lot of the early blues, you get these things that were modified, for lack of a better term, gospel tunes, but they reflected this African cosmology that the dead are still with us. And people say, oh, that's insane. But wait a minute, if we say in Christian traditions that that once we transition from this physical life, that we still have the spirits, why should it be so alien to understand that? So a lot of those earlier blues tunes, pre-World War II things really spoke to that. And the person who really got me, man, was Skip James, because it was just that falsetto, or I mean not falsetto, he had a high voice, but that real high voice, and the things he would talk about, like hard times, you know, things like that, Special Bride of Blues, things like that got me. And then I'd heard other tunes like these, like and you know, that's an old tune, Jesus Gonna Make Up My Dying Day. In my time of dying, don't want nobody to moan. All I want my friends to do is come over my dying arms. Well, so I can die easy. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah, Zeppelin used that too. They called it In My Time of Dying, but it's Jesus Gonna Make Up My Dying Bed. But it's like this real earthy thing, and where they use these different, like this kind of metaphorical things, like the last verse is, since I've been acquainted with Jesus, we haven't been a minute apart, put a receiver in my hand. You know, telephone receiver, true religion in my heart, you know, that type of thing. And so for folks coming from there, those early blues folks who brought over our ancestral ideas about the way the world was formed, even when you had the blues, the spirits were there, the ancestors were there. The creator was there. So that music, to me, was tied to the dust, but the dust held the ancestors too. The ancestors were there. So that's what that Walking with My Ancestors is about. And as an homage it's in a tuning, you know, that I learned from Skip James. You know, they call cross tuning, like it's you did like hear an open D or an open C or whatever tuning, but he would tune like to a minor like that. So you got this open minor chord, you know. That type of thing, which is the beginning of Hard Times Killing Floor, that type of thing.
Can you do that riff one more time?
So that whole, and tell me when we're about at the 20-minute mark.
I honestly have no idea.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
What in the
Well, I want to
question-
save 20 minutes roughly for any other, like just grabbing some flute and just any other B-roll stuff of him playing real quick, which will be.
Do you
real
want to
simple.
take a? Let's cut real fast.
Yeah.
This would be probably a good idea.
Yeah, let's cut really quick, just so we can get a grip on time. Sorry, I should have. Well, no, I did mark